Hello, I'm Professor Fred Long. You can just call me Fred.
Participles. Participles.
Well, today we're going to be talking about participles. Participles. Chapter 17. We're going to look at the formation of the participles and particularly look at two functions, the adjectival and the circumstantial participle. First, let's go to the vocabulary. Here we encounter more first declension nouns. Arche, beginning, rule, or power. Glossa, language or tongue. Graphe, scripture or writing. Evangelia, promise. Sophia, wisdom. Synagoge, gathering or synagogue. Soteria, salvation. Theme, honor. Kara, joy, delight. Kriya, need. And then we have a verb that's often found as a participle. Uparko, I exist. And then the negative adverb for non-indicative moods, may. We've already learned this form in dealing with questions. May will expect a negative answer, but it's used for non-indicative moods. So we're going to start to learn here the non-indicative moods. I'm going to start with the participle. The participle is a verbal adjective. As a verbal adjective, it has tense, voice, mood. And as an adjective, it's going to add gender, case, and number. So you have 6 attributes of a participle. Participles can function in 2 ways, adjectivally and adverbially. And because of this, they're fairly dynamic. But the reason why they're so dynamic is because they're not marked like a regular verb would be. They don't show time. They show only relative time. They can be placed anywhere, and they can modify nouns or the verb. And so that makes participles rather dynamic. In fact, participles are so dynamic that they need to be treated in several different chapters. And so in this chapter 17, we're going to be looking at adjectival and circumstantial, what might be called adverbial or has been called adverbial participles. And then in chapter 19, we'll look at a couple other uses of participles, and then also in chapter 20. In terms of frequency, the participles are the second most frequently occurring mood, with just over 6,600 occurrences. And so it's about 1/3 of the indicative mood verbs. So you see a lot of them, and you can see the comparison to the other moods there. Verbal aspect is retained, but time is relative. So there's no absolute time with the participles, and time relationships must be determined from context and sometimes from the tense of the participle, but that has to do more with verbal aspect. What's going to be really important with participles, particularly with circumstantial or non-adjectival participles, is their pre or post-nuclear position. Now, what I mean by that is, are they occurring before the main verb, or are they occurring afterwards? Verbal aspect is still retained. And so participles mainly occur in present tense forms, aorist tense forms, and there's just a handful of perfect tense forms, more than a handful. And then really there is just a handful of future tense, about 10 future tense participles. So mainly you need to really focus on the present and aorist tenses, and then some perfect tense. The verbal aspect is retained, so present tense participles will tend to be action that is simultaneous, contemporaneous to the main verb, ongoing. The aorist tense will have perfective aspect, the action seen as a whole, complete or completed, and will tend to be used to portray actions that are prior to the main verb. The perfect tense expresses a complex state of affairs, and it may indicate either action prior to or contemporaneous with the main verb. And then the future tense participle indicates often purpose or the goal of some action. Now, there's no augmentation outside the indicative mood, and that begins now with the participles. So the augment was something that was added to the verb stem to indicate remoteness, often signaling past time, but now it's not present. And so there is no absolute time with participles. The negative word for participles is may. May is normally used to negate a participle. Well, participles in English would be words like going, walking, teaching. You basically could take any verb and add an ing to it, and you could start to form a participle. Here are the active endings of the participle. Their third declension endings. On, ontos, onti, onta. So nominative, genitive, dative, singular. And then you have ontes, anton, usin, untas. The neuter is formed similarly, except with the neuter singular nominative and accusative being the same forms, on, and then the plural having onta. The feminine are formed with a coupling syllable and then using the first declension endings. So participles are 3, 1, 3 adjectives. That is, the masculine uses third declension, the feminine uses the first declension, and the neuter uses third declension. I should say the active formation of the participle is 3, 1, 3. So for the feminine coupling syllable, that'll vary depending on the tense. For the present tense, the coupling syllable is us. Us. So you're going to have us a, us es, us e, us an, us e, us on, us es, us as. Now the aorist is going to use a different coupling syllable, sas. The perfect active is going to use a different one, qui. And the aorist passive will use a different one, these. So the feminine forms of the participle are identical except for that coupling syllable, which will vary depending on the tense. Now something similar happens with the masculine and the neuter participles. Rather than an omicron, ont, the coupling syllable becomes for the aorist active sant. The sigma alpha appears once again. For the perfect, you have a kappa, and a kappa with an omicron, and very distinctively, the nu drops, kotos. And so this is a feature of the perfect participle form. So the perfect is going to have its characteristic kappa in its ending and the corresponding lack of the nu. The aorist passive is going to have its theta, but rather than an eta, it's going to have an epsilon. So this is, in a nutshell, how these participles are formed. Now you can see their formations by tense and the voice in the textbook in what follows. So these endings for the present active have been put onto pistevo. So pistevon, pistevontos, etc. For the feminine, you have pistevusa, pistevuses, etc. And then you can go into the plural. These are very regular patterns, so you just have to understand the coupling syllable. Understand that third declension endings are placed onto a coupling syllable for the masculine and the neuter. And then for the feminine, you have a coupling syllable as well, and you're using the first declension endings. Here are the first aorist active participle endings. Their coupling syllable is a sigma alpha. So sas, santos, santi, santa. For the feminine singular, you have sas, sasa, sase, sase, sasan. And for the neuter, you just have the same third declension, but with different nominative and accusative forms. For the aorist passive, the coupling syllable is a theta, epsilon. For the masculine neuter, for the masculine nominative singular, it's a little bit different, thes, but then you see thentos, thenti, thenta. For the feminine singular, thesa, theses, these, thesan. And for the neuter, the same, except using the nominative and accusative forms, then, thentos, thenti, then. For the perfect participle, you can see as well that you have a kappa for the masculine and for the feminine, and you have the characteristic missing of the nu, and that'll help you with identifying these forms. Also, if you've been keeping track of accents, which I know that accents are not stressed a lot in learning beginning Greek, but there's a violation of accent rules here. Typically, this accent would want to get onto this preceding syllable, the antepenult syllable, but it's retained over the coupling syllable, and that's characteristic of the perfect participle formation. Kos, kotos, koti, kota for the masculine. The feminine coupling syllable is qui, quia, quias, quia, quian, and you can see the neuter there. Now there are second aorist formations of the participle. They don't like the sa endings, and so they will use the present endings. On, ontos, onti, onta. So this can be just a little bit tricky because you might think that you're looking at a present participle, but how will you know that you're not? You'll know that you're not because you have a change in the stem form. You've got a changed stem, which indicates third principal part, and that's just characteristic of participles. Well, participles are a lot to handle. Fortunately, the present form of participle of imi is basically the endings. On, ontos, onti, onta. Those are the basic endings, and so it's not so hard to learn the participle forms of imi. Well, let's talk about their functions. As verbal adjectives, participles will take on adjectival functions. They'll modify nouns, they'll stand in the place of a noun. And so these are very similar to what you've learned in terms of adjectives. So there's attributive use. Here you have salvation, the word soterian, which is modified by a participle, which is in the attributive position. Tein soterian, tein kerukthisan. This is an aorist passive participle from keruso. The verb means I preach. As a passive, it would be preached. And so the salvation preached might be one way that you could translate that. I will like to use the relative pronoun that, not who or which, because I want to differentiate from regular relative pronoun clauses. But the participle here is functioning attributively, and we can use that as a type of clause to help indicate the presence of an attributive participle. So here we have the salvation that was preached. Now notice that there can be different attributive positions. Here, this first one is the second attributive position. This second one is the first attributive position, the preached salvation. These basically are going to be rendered the same, and they indicate attributive use. The teaching apostle, we might better render that as the apostle that teaches. And sometimes this participle will have its own modifiers. As verbs, they can have their own direct objects, they can have their own modifiers and adverbs and these kinds of things. And that can make participles a little bit tricky. So participles will occur in the case in which they're used. So they can occur in any case, and it just depends on what noun they're modifying. Now the substantive use is when the participle functions alone and acts like a noun or substantive. So you might run across a participle that is standing alone, and you have to supply a generic noun to that form, just like you would a substantive adjective. So this is the teaching, literally it would be the teaching. Well, it's nominative case, it's masculine, And so we can add the generic word, the one that is teaching, or the man that is teaching. Notice that it has its own direct object, tous alous, the man or the one that is teaching others, perites basilias, about the kingdom. Here's an idiom that you'll see a lot, is this participle huparkonta, with a ta at the front, is translated the existing things, or the things, or the belongings. So literally it means the existing things, but it signifies that which belongs to people, the belongings. Rather rare is the predicate use. This is the third of the adjectival uses, and you can see an example of one here. The word of God is living, zone. This is from the participle form from zao, I live. Now participles, the adjective participle is a more robust description. By using a participle rather than an adjective, you're ascribing a verbal attribute. And so that verbal attribute entails action and may have other modifiers. So the use of adjectival participles is usually very strategic and provides a more robust, vivid description. I have a bit of a discussion of different attributive positions and their significance. Well, let's talk about circumstantial participles. Often these participles are called adverbial participles. There's a problem with this, though, and the problem is that adverbial relationships like time, cause, means, concession, condition, etc., these adverbial relationships are not inherently marked in the participle form. And it's a mistake for us to begin thinking automatically that participles that function that are not adjectival are automatically inherently meaning these different things. In fact, such participles are unmarked for these relationships. That's the beauty of them, is that they're unmarked. And any kind of adverbial significance must be determined from context. If an author wanted to mark one of these adverbial relationships, they would have used some kind of subordinating conjunction, and Greek has many of those, to mark that kind of relationship. So I think it's best to consider these circumstantial participles. And you can read here the quotes from the great grammarian A.T. Robertson on the matter. How do you recognize a circumstantial participle? A circumstantial participle is going to be modifying a verb, the main verb, or a verb in a subordinate clause. It will never have the article with it. So that's one indicator of identifying the circumstantial participle. It's almost always in the nominative case as well. That's another clue. It doesn't always have to be in the nominative case, but most of the time it will be. So no article, often in the nominative case. Those are good clues that you're looking at a circumstantial participle. Phyllis Healy and Alan Healy have some additional contextual factors that are worth looking at. Now, who performs the action of the adverbial circumstantial participle? Actually, any person in the sentence can do it. Well, let's look at a couple of examples. So, seeing, let's translate this literally, and or moreover, seeing the crowds, he had compassion concerning them. Here, the circumstantial participle idon is referring to the subject. It's nominative, idon, and in this case, it's referring to the he. I can get away by translating it pretty minimally, and seeing the crowds, and the idea of time is indicated by context, by location, and by the fact that we're dealing with an aorist participle, which, when it's pre-nuclear to the verb, here's the verb, tends to have a time prior time significance. In this next example, Jesus is going along, and he is not the subject. So two blind men come and were following him, that's the subject. And this happens while Jesus is on the move. So in this case, the circumstantial participle is referring to the direct object. They followed him. That's in the dative case because this verb takes the dative case. And then you have Jesus as the subject of the participle clause, the circumstantial participle clause. And so in this case, it's also pre-nuclear to the verb. So here's the main verb. It's placed in a pre-nuclear verb position, but it's not an aorist participle. It is a present tense participle, which tends to be time simultaneous or contemporaneous to the main verb. And here in English, the word as or while helps to capture that time simultaneous nature of the present tense participle. The biggest point here is to notice that the circumstantial participles agrees with its subject in all respects, gender, case, and number. Already I've been talking about the importance of pre-nuclear placement, identifying that as opposed to post-nuclear. So let's talk about some of the significances of when a participle is placed in a pre-nuclear position. First, it marks a transitional segue. It's not marked for discontinuity. So participles used at the beginning of a clause are often helping to connect or stay connected with preceding context. So they're not marked for discontinuity. Here's an example of some different subordinating clauses. The first showing discontinuity, the second showing not discontinuity. And you can look at that example. Pre-nuclear circumstantial participles can also describe procedural action, which is prior to the main verb. So it's like logical procedural information, like this happened first, so that, or then this happened. So here's an example of the Magi who were sent, and then he said to them after sending them, "Going, inquire accurately about the child." So really, this is Herod, and he wants to inquire about the child. That's the main idea. And yet we get this participle, which means going. It really doesn't seem necessary. He could have just said, "Hey, inquire accurately about the child." Instead, he adds a procedural participle at the front that is pre-nuclear and describes a prior logical necessary step. Now, as I describe this and look at this example, this idea of going and sending and coming is significant contextually for a theme. These are sometimes seemingly unnecessary procedural descriptions, but they may have been added for cultural or thematic significance to develop a theme. Now, sometimes the pre-nuclear circumstantial participle can provide a contextual framework, an important contextual framework for understanding the main verb and subsequent events. And so here is an example. One thing I know, that being blind, now I see. This idea of being blind is an important framework for the main verb. In this case, the main verb is now I'm seeing. So an important framework to understand the main verb is the fact that this guy was blind. He couldn't see prior to Jesus healing him. And so that's an important framework. It's not really procedural, but it's an important framework for what follows. And you can see some other examples of an important framework for the main verb. This is a very extreme example with this woman who has this ailment of a blood flow. And there are 7 participle clauses, circumstantial participle clauses, which describe her plight prior to then touching Jesus. And it's an amazing description of providing an important context for then the action of the main verb. Be sure to check out the checkpoint and practice your understanding of circumstantial participles. Now, post-nuclear placement involves slightly different function of the participles, that is the circumstantial participles. A post-nuclear placement, what that does is it allows the main verb to take precedent, and then the circumstantial participle will tend to have different functions. One of them would be to explicate or qualify particular dimensions of the main verb. So a post-nuclear circumstantial participle provides details and explication of the main verb. And so you can look at these examples here. So Acts 19:9, he separated the disciples, that's the main verb, each day dialoguing or instructing them in the school of Tyrannus. That participle clause, that post-nuclear circumstantial participle clause, provides perhaps a reason why he did what he did. It explicates some of the particular dimensions of this, and also provides particular details and description about what was entailed in Paul separating the disciples out. So this distinction between pre-nuclear and post-nuclear is very important to understand. Now, sometimes the post-nuclear participle will involve a verb that is redundant with the main verb. The main verb may be a verb of speaking, like Jesus said, and then you have legon, saying. Well, that redundant participle is a forward-pointing and emphasizing device. And so this is fairly common. And the thing is that these participles of redundancy may not be translated. So they're particularly fun to see and to understand that they're forward-pointing and often emphasizing devices. Now, I've mentioned before that this category of participle may be called and is often called adverbial. So I thought I would provide a brief discussion here of different adverbial senses that scholars have identified as strategies or ways to translate some of these circumstantial participles. Again, I want to reiterate that these circumstantial participles are actually unmarked for these relationships. And so these become some strategies that we may have when thinking about translating these circumstantial participles. I would caution you to avoid atomization and the fallacy of categorization. And sometimes people get really committed to saying, well, no, this is a causal participle here, or this must be a temporal participle here. Well, no, because the participles are not marked for those things. Those adverbial senses come from the context, the verb meaning and the location, and are not inherent in the participle itself. So here, read this discussion of adverbial senses. You have temporal uses, you have sometimes substantiation or causal, meaning because, purpose, in order that, concession, although, conditional, if, resultative, with the result that, means, with or by, manner, how something is done. And here's a chart that shows some possible relations of tense of the participle with the time, relative time of the main verb. Remember that aorist participles that are pre-nuclear tend to be time prior. Present tense participles that are pre-nuclear tend to be time simultaneous. And so that's a helpful category. But you can look at this chart as Daniel Wallace has attempted to describe senses of adverbial meanings in relation to the main verb. Be sure to read the case in point. One of my favorite verses is right here, where Paul commands believers to be filled with the Spirit and then describes what that looks like by post-nuclear circumstantial participles.